Usually when you see people make lists and talk about visual novels, they tend to just talk about their favorites or what they consider the best or worst visual novels of certain types. But what if we take into account visual novels that are just decent, they're flawed, but just maybe good enough to appeal to a specific type of person? In this video, I'm going to talk about kind of good visual novels that were almost great, just didn't quite reach their full potential. The first visual novel I'm going to be talking about is Chrono Clock, developed by Purplesoft. I know this visual novel has fans, but I know just as many people who are heavily disappointed when you consider its setting. What do I mean by this? One of the main features of Chrono Clock is that the main character has a really unique skill of being able to break his pocket watch to turn back time of about 5 or so minutes. He can only do this every hour or so. 5 minutes doesn't seem like a lot, but at least in the first half of the common route, you'd be surprised how much can change just by changing a few things within that time frame. I thought this part of the common route was done excellently, with a really interesting arc about the main character helping this girl attempt to confess to her crush. However, she's cripplingly shy and tends to get along with the main character well enough to ask him for advice. Seeing how this arc concludes and how the main character uses the time reversal gimmick was pretty interesting. However, once you get past this part of the common route is unfortunately where things start to slow down a lot. This is where the visual novel transitions into more of the traditional moege slice of life style. The main character meets with 4 of the main heroines that he can romance. Honestly, while all of them aren't bad characters, I'd say most of them are pretty forgettable and not immediately making me think, man, I'd want to date any of them now. While the main character's sister being blind was kind of an interesting concept, her near yandere levels of obsession with him was kind of unnerving and annoying, while the rich girl was kind of sort of amusing. While Makoto did have a kind of interesting hidden side to her, otherwise I wasn't particularly interested in her. The only route I did was DD's, and that's purely because I thought her English was funny. She's not a particularly deep or engaging character, she's just a weird weeb foreigner. Her route was mostly dull except for a really interesting twist at the end, which sadly wasn't utilized to its best potential. Also, the protagonist in her route basically almost stopped using his time reversal powers, which just seems kind of weird when you consider that the name is literally called Chrono Clock and how much he used this power in the common route. Chrono Clock to me is the perfect example of a visual novel with really interesting ideas, but just not using them for some reason, and playing things surprisingly safe. I would only recommend this to people if any of the main 5 heroines particularly interest you. Otherwise, I think almost every other Purplesoft visual novel in English is much more interesting, especially I Want Tsutsumi. The next visual novel I'm going to be talking about is Input Output, or I.O. This is definitely one of those visual novels I think of when I think doesn't meet its full potential. Now, does it have good elements? Absolutely. One of the main defining draws of this visual novel is that it's a mystery sci-fi thriller visual novel written by Takumi Nakazawa, who's best known for being a big writer and director for visual novels such as Ever 17, Remember 11, and Root Double. Input Output, for better or for worse, is quite possibly the most ambitious English translated sci-fi mystery thriller visual novel out there. There are 10 total routes with a kind of enforced read order. Unlike the Infinity series or Root Double, the characters are not trapped in an enclosed space, meaning the setting is a lot more open, kind of like Baldur's Sky, with an insane amount of world-building, mind-blowing plot twists, a surprising amount of action scenes, and just a whole lot of stuff going on. Every single route has a brand new character POV perspective. This is something that I think is really cool and wish were done more often. I.O. just has a lot of really unique and interesting storytelling and plot twists that's basically worth reading for these alone. So what prevents I.O. from being one of the greatest visual novels and just something only kind of good? The first thing that I always point out is that it's incredibly inconsistent pacing-wise. There's some routes like Route A and E, which are definitely on the slower side, with A in particular starring only a few characters with a lot of build-up, but also a lot of boring slice of life before the good stuff happens. On the other hand, Route B is shorter and a little bit more fast-paced than Route A, but has the unfortunate issue of having way more major characters and not enough time to develop them. Route C and D are both basically doing speed runs to be the fastest mystery routes ever, with both having a crazy twist towards the end, but also just being kinda confusing to navigate. Speaking of the characters, another flaw I have with I.O. is honestly, most of the characters just aren't that good. This is basically a visual novel that focuses more on the story and not the character development or depth. It's not that the characters aren't likable per se, they're just insanely forgettable, with some purposely not even given that much screen time. Unfortunately, a few endings, especially the very last one, have Evangelion Gainax style endings that are just insanely confusing for no reason. These are not the type of endings I'd want to see in a mystery visual novel. It sucked that these flaws exist because I.O. could have been something really good, one of the best mystery visual novels even, but now I can only recommend it to the most hardcore of mystery fans who are willing to accept its flaws because there are really cool aspects of it. The next visual novel I'm going to be talking about is Eden, developed by Minori. These are the same people who wrote F, A Fairy Tale of the Two, and Shino Line. This is a linear nakige and has a pretty unique setting that starts with a group of people preparing to evacuate humanity from Earth from an impending energy mass from space, before going into kind of a post-apocalyptic type of setting. I like that even though this is a nakige, it doesn't really act like a key visual novel and try to be overly melodramatic. The best way I can describe it is it's pretty somber. I won't tell you what happens, but once the main character and the main girl get together, there's this inevitability that they'll have to deal with, and while they obviously keep track of it, it doesn't get overly dramatic, which I kind of liked, which was pretty unique compared to other nakige. While this is a nakige, and while on one hand I did like that they didn't get overly dramatic, it did cause another problem. It kind of just felt like a nakige just going through the motions. The characters are likable, and the things they go through are pretty interesting, but I guess I just didn't really feel the strong feels by the end. Like, I'm guessing it was part of the point that this inevitability was coming, but for being a supposed nakige, the emotional moments just weren't as emotional as I was hoping. I guess when I think of nakige, I like when they actually surprise me, but considering that due to the premise there's almost no surprises, it just made Eden not as memorable as I thought. Even though the execution of basically everything else was pretty solid, I think one thing they could have done better in particular was develop the relationship between the main two characters more. As it stands, in the first half of the story, there's quite a number of characters who don't really matter in the second half. But even in the second half, they introduce a couple of other characters who just kind of show up for no reason. They don't really add anything. I just feel like they're there just to have more characters for the sake of it. Another weird minor critique I would say is that Eden does have H scenes, except this visual novel does them in a very strange way. First of all, to get the H scenes, you have to buy a completely separate version on Manga Gamer. You can't just apply an 18+ patch. Second of all, the H scenes have this very rare feature where the H scenes unlock after reading the whole visual novel from start to finish. So for people who like to get immersed seeing H scenes during the story, you'll be disappointed to see that they're basically just afterthoughts just to make sure the visual novel sells to the right people. That said, for the people who don't like H scenes, this is probably a positive thing since it technically satisfies both sides. I think as far as nakige goes, I think F, A Fairy Tale of the Two has much more memorable emotional moments compared to Eden. That said, Eden has the advantage of being much shorter and being a linear story at around 10 hours. If that's closer to your preferred length for visual novels, Eden, like most nakige, tends to have solid emotional music, and I think it did a pretty good job there, along with some nice atmospheric stuff fitting the game. So if you're a fan of visual novels like Planetarian, Autry My Dear Moments, or Ginka, perhaps something like Eden Sharp can be good for you. Just don't expect to be quite on the same level as the other three. The next visual novel I'm going to be talking about is Comyu, developed by Akatsuki Works. If I.O. was the overly ambitious sci-fi mystery story, Comyu is an overly ambitious fantasy action chuni visual novel in a similar vein to something like Fate Stay Night, Rewrite, or Dies Irae. Comyu is the perfect example of something with great concepts. The setting is quite interesting, essentially being a battle royale where 5 people have to control what they call an avatar and fight other avatars. Many of these avatars are big fantasy animals or robots. For example, the main group controls a really big, cool-looking black dragon. The really interesting thing about this avatar system, if the avatar itself takes enough hits and dies, then all 5 people that are grouped together to form the avatar get killed. This creates some really interesting stakes as the main group will have to come to terms with potentially killing other people, but also have to watch their own backs. It helps that these main group of characters are the epitome of a ragtag group of people formed forcibly with incredibly misaligned schedules and morals. This ends up creating some really interesting interactions with a bunch of the side characters, and especially one of the major antagonists in Gasai. Some of the fights, while kind of long, are constantly interesting because of the threat of the loser having 5 people killed, so this makes it so retreat from battle is legitimately a very viable strategy just so people don't get killed. There's also some really interesting life philosophies and character depth and drama that are very interesting concepts and raise the intrigue of the game and the characters as you read on. So what's the deal? Why is this game not quite great? Well, unfortunately, this visual novel is just very mixed on how it executes its story. The first major issue is our protagonist Akito. He's the definition of a flawed protagonist, which sounds great on paper, and some people may even like him. However, he just personally does not do it for me. He kind of annoys me more than be endearing. While he has a tragic incident revolving losing his mom, this causes him to end up simping for girls way too often, including people he doesn't even know very well, to the point he saves girls he literally just met. He's also what I like to call a man whore, someone willing to basically sleep around with any girl that's willing to give him her body. It gets to the point where in the different character routes, he ends up having sex very often with another girl that's not the named heroine, even though he's supposed to be going out with her. Also, his trauma to constantly remind the reader that he remembers the red color is just so overly melodramatic that it's just kind of hilarious. Remember how I said that there's some interesting life philosophies and potential character life and death situations related to the story? Well, what if I told you that there's two routes that have nothing to do with the plot, specifically Mayuki's and Ayaya's route? Mayuki at least has the advantage of being in the main character group, and her route might honestly be the best written route in the whole game. But Ayaya is a completely random, unnecessary character with a short route that did not mean to be in the game. However, the other three routes have plenty of their own issues that I haven't even talked about. The common route was great at setting up some of the character motivations while keeping some of the mystery up front. The problem with the other three major heroine routes I haven't mentioned yet is many times they don't even focus on the main heroine much. I know this happens kind of often, like for example in Dies Irae, the four main heroines barely get romance, but people were fine with it since it focused a lot on the villains. However, these three story-heavy routes are the epitome of a visual novel writer getting way too ambitious for his own good. There's just so many characters and plot threads that he has to cover, which in theory should have a lot of impact, but they just end up not doing so because there's just so much going on that there's not enough proper build-up when these supposedly big moments do happen. It's especially unfortunate for Hisoka, a character who doesn't even get notable screen time and development until halfway through her own route. That's right, you get a route of a character you don't even meet except for like maybe one moment in the common route. I can go on and on, but at the end of the day, I can basically only recommend this visual novel if you just really want to see more fantasy action toony visual novels. You just want to see something with an interesting life or death situation, unique life philosophies, even if they're not consistently well executed. Apparently, Hello Lady, a visual novel by the same developer, is a better version of Comyu, but considering I also hear mixed things about that visual novel, I'm pretty hesitant to read or recommend that either. The final visual novel I'm going to be talking about is what's probably going to be the hottest take in this whole video, the original Kinkoi Golden Loverish. Many people cite this as one of, if not the best English translated moege out there. On the surface, I can certainly see why. It definitely has its strong points. Kinkoi is like what I like to call a jack-of-all-trades moege. While it doesn't have the best comedy, it's still pretty solid. It doesn't have the best melodrama, but it's definitely not bad. It doesn't have the most wholesome romance or character development, but it's still decent and has solid moments here and there. I also think that the main character, Oro, is slightly above average compared to most moege protagonists, since he actually has something of a personality, and I would also say, on the whole, the main heroines are decently likable. I just don't think any of them are top-tier heroines like many other people do. Kinkoi also has a locked true route, which while I think is a little overrated, I can definitely see why people love it, basically being a solid Nakige route, and I'm sure that's not what many moege fans are used to. With how much I've talked about it, you would think I would agree with the crowd and think Kinkoi is one of the best moege out there, but to me, any good points Kinkoi has are ruined by really stupid flaws. The first one I definitely want to get out of the way is the fact that this visual novel relies on the main character Oro having very convenient amnesia for the plot. It'd be one thing if the main character had something like trauma that would make him forget specific things, but it's clear the writer just did it just to make some supposed to be very surprising twists. But honestly, I just thought many of these so-called twists didn't need to be twists at all. This extends to dumb little interactions like the plot trying to make a twist of what the character Chieka is to Oro. Apparently, a lot of people really like Reina as a character, but I personally wasn't a fan of her. She does have some good aspects, like how she has that female friend thing and can have some motherly aspects, but the amount of sexual harassment jokes she gets away with just because she's a hot gyaru girl is quite frustrating, especially if Oro were to make the same jokes, the characters treat him like shit. Speaking of Reina, her route has one of the worst plot twists I've seen in visual novels. They could have had an interesting slow build of a friends to lovers relationship like Furukawa. Let's just say the way they get together is through accidental drugs. If you have not read the route, you'll see what I mean. The other routes are pretty flawed as well. While I like Sylvie as a character, I want to say at least half her route is just boring rich girl stuff. While I thought the true route was good, I thought it was pretty predictable, relied on a bunch of the main characters' apparent convenient amnesia, and some of the drama just felt like really cheesy soap opera melodrama. Some of these flaws might be minor at best to some people, but to me, these ruined what could have been a very solid moege, and instead something I have much more mixed feelings on. Thankfully, I surprisingly liked Akane and her side route quite a bit, and I personally don't get the indifference or hate she gets. I prefer the Fandisc Kinkoi Golden Time overall, especially for the alternate universe version of the true route. And that is it, 5 visual novels I consider almost great, but just didn't quite reach their full potential. But what were your thoughts on the 5 visual novels that I chose for this video? And do you think there are others that you think could have been fitting? Feel free to leave a comment below.